TLM thing on the shoulder is not the maple leaf.
No, this is old. This is from...
Yeah, no, the maple leaf. No, but the maple leaf on the shoulders. I hate that TLM thing.
Yeah, this is from 2003. And the reason why I'm wearing it is because I usually wear my jersey the first game of the playoffs, and we always really lose. So I decided not to do it. And I know you really can't affect it by actually wearing a jersey, but I'm a superstitious fan. So I'm finally wearing it right now. And watch, I bet you they go and now lose the next 4 games in a row.
Superstitious fan is redundant. Is it the beach or the beaches? Singular or plural? Be careful about posing this question because people have very strong opinions about the right answer. The argument for the beaches is simple. There are 4 different beaches in the neighborhood, so it should be plural. However, longtime residents argue that the beach was the original name, and by this point, the different beaches have all merged into one anyways. In 1985, the city had to remove street signs describing the neighborhood as the beaches, and in 2006, the local business improvement area had to rescind a decision to call it the beach on new street signs. So, there's no consensus even within the neighborhood. This episode is about the beaches. That's the official name used by all levels of government, and that's what we're going to call it. If you have an objection, send us a rebuttal, and we might read it before a future episode. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller. And this is Muddy York.
The boundaries of the beaches can be a complicated question. So instead of trying to identify precise borders, we're just going to use some general geographic features. For the purposes of this episode, the beaches go from Ashbridges Bay in the west to the Scarborough Bluffs in the east, and from Lake Ontario in the south to Kingston Road in the north. The first people to inhabit the beaches would have been various indigenous groups. However, no significant archaeology has been conducted in this area, so we can only surmise about these early residents. The first written records about the area come from the 1793 Plan for York Harbor, drawn up for John Graves Simcoe shortly after the town of York was created. It divided the area into rectangular land plots, split along an east-west baseline that divided larger inland plots from smaller but more valuable lakeside plots. Today, that baseline is known as Queen Street. Most of these plots were granted to private owners in an attempt to create a land-owning British elite. So far as we can tell, none of these people actually lived on their plots. They held them as investments, hoping to sell them in the future.
In 1799, the government hired a contractor to build a road eastwards towards Kingston. Initially, it followed the future path of Queen Street. However, the builders knew that the road would have to reach higher ground as it went through Scarborough. So, to avoid an overly steep climb, the road veered north a few kilometers east of town to begin a more gradual ascent. The area east of this turn and south of the road to Kingston, or Kingston Road as we now know it today, is what would become the beaches. Because of this lack of adequate roads, as late as 1865, Queen Street past the turnoff was described as country trail with stumps and trees scattered in the midst. The beaches would remain largely underdeveloped for the next 60 years. The only major change during this period is that the southern part of this area, everything south of Queen Street as far east as Maclean Avenue, was incorporated into the city of Toronto when it was created in 1834. There was virtually nothing there at this time. The city leaders correctly guessed that the waterfront property would become a valuable commodity. Development in the beaches really began in the 1870s. First, York County allowed the Toronto Gravel Road and Concrete Company to build a tramway along the south side of Kingston Road on the condition that it also carry passengers. One of the tram spots was at the Woodbine Driving and Racing Park that opened in 1875 at Coxwell and Woodbine. For the next 80 years, this would be considered the premier horse track in Toronto. The current Woodbine racetrack kept this name even though it's nowhere near Woodbine. In 1878, Victoria Park opened, not the road, but an amusement park that gave the road its name. It was located on the current site of the R.C. Harris water treatment plant. There still weren't any reliable roads, so visitors would arrive on regularly scheduled steamboats from the harbor. The park had a grand pavilion surrounded by two-story veranda for dining and dances. It also had a lookout tower on the hill above the park that offered a view from Toronto all the way to the Scarborough Bluffs. This was fancy stuff in the Toronto of 1878. The tower was nicknamed the Sway because it would sway in high winds and would eventually be knocked over in a storm. Politicians liked to use the park for political rallies, and John A. Macdonald once delivered a 6-hour speech there.
A local landowner named Joseph Williams was impressed by the success of Victoria Park, and a year later, he opened his own park named Kew Gardens. His ads proclaimed that Kew Gardens was a place where visitors could rent tents or summer cottages and buy fruit and vegetables from the Williams garden. He built a wooden walkway over the wetlands along the lakeshore, an early version of the famous beach's boardwalk. Breakfast, afternoon tea, and supper could all be purchased, but no spirituous liquors would be served. This was Toronto the Good. Williams also began leasing out some of his land along Lake Ontario for people to erect cottages. His neighbors got into the act in a big way by subdividing their beachfront property into smaller lots that they sold to buyers looking for a warm weather retreat. As a result, the lakefront between Woodbine and Kew Gardens became an almost continuous line of cottages. Something similar was happening north of Balmy Beach, where a judge named Adam Wilson, anybody with that name must be trusted because he's an Adam after all, bought a large plot of land and began selling off portions to friends and partners who erected summer cottages. The big difference was that the cottages near Kew Gardens were fairly small, sometimes only 15 or 20 feet across, whereas the cottages north of Balmy Beach were rich people cottages, which is to say that they were bigger than most of the houses in Toronto. So, by the 1880s, the beaches had become an early version of cottage country. The 1880s were also important for what was happening away from the beach. In 1887, Toronto annexed Queen Street and began grading the road to level out the surface. However, the most important effect of this annexation was that it contractually obligated the Toronto Street Railway to extend its streetcar lines all the way to Maclean. The company was concerned about a lack of traffic along this route, and so it decided to build an attraction that would convince people to travel all the way out to the sticks. As a result, in 1896, the Toronto Street Railway opened Monroe Park. Also known as Trolley Park because of the reason for its creation, Monroe Park had something that Victoria Park didn't: electricity. This was used to illuminate 1,600 colored lights strung across the park. It could also power rides, like a large rotating wheel, just like the one that Gale Ferris had built for the World's Fair in Chicago.
The new streetcar line also had a dramatic effect on the neighborhood. In the same way that condo buildings started to rise along Sheppard after the Line 4 subway was built there, housing construction exploded after the streetcar line opened. Remember, there were no private cars at this time. A streetcar line suddenly made it possible for people to live in the suburbs while commuting to and from downtown for work. People who owned large plots of land in the beaches began to subdivide them into smaller lots. That's why they're called subdivisions. Either they built homes on these lots or sold them to developers who did the same thing. Many of these developers were small-timers who would buy a single lot on which they built a handful of houses, one for themselves and the rest that they would sell. The Toronto World wrote, "The workman's hammer, the carpenter's saw, and the merry voices of 100 builders echo through the groves of Balmy Beach. Everywhere the air is redolent with burning pitch and the smell of newly cut pine. For a small boom in the building line is in great progress, and many houses are under construction." This was a slow process. As late as 1900, a reporter only counted 287 houses east of Woodbine. However, there were other signs of development. Churches began cropping up along Queen Street, Bell opened a Beach's telephone exchange, and a new fire hall was built at the corner of Queen and Herbert.
The Toronto Street Railway's lease for the land for Monroe Park expired in 1907, and it was more profitable for the landowner to use it for housing. So the company purchased the Scarborough Beach Amusement Park from its bankrupt owners. Scarborough Beach was the last of the big amusement parks to be built in the beaches. It was deliberately modeled on Coney Island in New York, and most closely resembled the carnivals that we know today, with rides, games, concerts, and overpriced concessions. One of the more creative attractions would recreate real-life disasters with a miniature city on stage and a presenter to explain the build-up to the event. Then the stage lights would dim, there would be flashes and sound effects, and when the lights came on, all of the miniature buildings would be knocked over. People were easier to impress back then. Over the course of 1908 and 1909, Toronto would annex this entire area as far east as Victoria Park. Joining Toronto brought improved infrastructure, but the most long-term effect came from the city's decision to purchase Kew Gardens and convert it into a public park. The Williams family still owned much of the land, but some lots had been sold, and the city wound up paying $125,000, roughly the equivalent of $3.5 million today, to expropriate the land.
That's a pretty good deal. In 1925, the Scarborough Beach Amusement Park closed down. The Toronto Railway Company had lost its main business 4 years earlier when the city created the TTC, and the park was facing new competition from the Sunnyside Amusement Park. The city decided that this would be an ideal opportunity to convert the beachfront into a public space. The idea of creating a park along the waterfront had been kicking around for at least a decade, but the amusement park had always stood in the way. Now that it was gone, the city began the process of expropriating private property along the lakeshore and removing the cottages from land that it had already owned. It also began building groins, which are actually submerged wooden structures shaped like an arrowhead extending into the lake at right angles from the land. I guess that kind of makes sense. It looks like a groin, I guess. These encourage sand deposits on shore and can actually be used to create and expand beaches. On Victoria Day, 1932, the Eastern Beaches Waterfront Park opened with 60,000 visitors. The only private property left was the Balmy Beach Club. This was a private club that had formed in 1903 when Balmy Beach was still part of a separate municipality called East Toronto. When the city joined Toronto, several club members were part of the negotiating team and insisted that Balmy Beach be managed separately from the Parks Department, which allowed their clubhouse to remain on the beach. Crafty moves. When the city was expropriating land during the 20s, it was concerned that this clause would create an extended legal battle, so they decided to let the club stay where it was. The Balmy Beach Club has a distinguished history. Several members have won Olympic medals, and the Balmy Beach football team, the Balmy Beachers, won 2 Grey Cups back when amateur teams were allowed to compete. However, it would also be at the center of some ugly events the following year.
The creation of a large new park guaranteed that local residents would always be able to enjoy the waterfront. However, large numbers of people from other parts of the city also began traveling to the beaches during the summer months. This led to a chorus of local complaints. Some of these were just the usual complaints that you would expect in any busy area: crowds, noise, pollution, and the like. This was aggravated by the fact that many locals still thought of it as their beach and were unhappy about an influx of outsiders. However, there was a darker side to these complaints. In 1933, many of the people traveling to the beach were immigrants. These people came from many different backgrounds, but they were inevitably described as Jewish. Many of them were, but Jewish also became a generic label for anyone foreign, which is to say, not British. These visitors had different customs and often spoke a foreign language. Modern Torontonians would scarcely notice, but such a thing was appalling to 1930 sensibilities. In late July, someone posted a letter on the bulletin board at the Balmy Beach Club asking for help to rid the beach of undesirables. On August 1st, placards painted with swastikas and Hail Hitler, Hail was misspelt by the way, appeared outside the club, and a second letter appeared on the bulletin board calling on members to join the Swastika Committee. Later that evening, 30 or 40 so-called swastikas paraded up and down the boardwalk. A Jewish gang, led by Al Kaufman, self-proclaimed king of the hobos, arrived in front of the Balmy Beach Club, presumably looking for a fight. By the time they arrived, the placards had been taken down, and the club hurriedly ended the dance that had been taking place. However, once the Jewish gang had left, the swastikas reformed and marched along the boardwalk again, chanting anti-Semitic songs. Political and religious leaders harshly condemned the swastikas, who unconvincingly insisted that they had nothing against Jews and were only opposed to obnoxious visitors. The next weekend, a confrontation between a crowd and two swastikas was diffused only when police compelled them to remove their emblem. Following a meeting with representatives of the Jewish community, the club agreed to abandon the swastika logo and change its name to the Beaches Protective Association. However, the club insisted that it would, quote, carry on the aims and objects of the Swastika Club in its entirety, to rid the beaches of nuisances caused by Jewish, Gentile, or any other creeds. These events are often seen as a prelude to the more famous events at Christie Pitts later that month.
While all of this was happening, the city had purchased the former grounds of Victoria Park at the foot of the street that bears its name and began construction of a pumping station and purification plant to improve water quality and address shortages. Construction began in 1932, and in 1941, the R.C. Harris water treatment plant began operations. The whole thing was so opulent that it became known as the Palace of Purification. It's usually open to visitors for Doors Open Toronto, and Adam, I think you were telling me about it?
As a note, some of you will know that this weekend is Doors Open, and the R.C. Harris water treatment plant is usually on the list. You may not think that a water treatment plant would be that interesting to see, but I would encourage you to make the trip because it really is quite distinct, and if nothing else, the view of the lake from the bluff where it sits is absolutely gorgeous. So there's a weekend activity for you.
By the 1940s, the beaches broadly resembled the neighborhood that would stand there for the next 30 years. It was overwhelmingly residential, with virtually no industry and commercial activity, restricted to Queen Street and Kingston Road. It was broadly middle class, with slightly more upper middle class households in the east and slightly more lower middle class households in the west. It was also overwhelmingly British. This would have described much of Toronto at this time, but the minority population of the beaches was small, even by contemporary standards. In 1951, 66% of Toronto's population had British ancestry. In the beaches, that number was 83%. As one person wrote in his memoir about growing up there, the beaches in 1950s was white. It wasn't just white, it was Anglo-Saxon white, and it was Protestant white. As late as 1971, 74% of the beach's population was British compared to 46% for Toronto as a whole. Some people argue that this problem persists to this day. By the late 1960s, local houses were beginning to reach the end of their natural life, especially wooden homes that had been built around the turn of the century. They were drafty and old. Many of the people living in these homes were comfortable, but not rich, and they didn't have the money to pay for expensive renovations. Robert Fulford, who grew up in the beaches, dates its discovery to 1970. That's when it started to become fashionable and real estate prices began to climb. In 1972, a group of architects wrote, "This small precinct has become very desirable and highly sought-after area in which to live." As Fulford described it, carpenters, clerks, and salesmen were replaced by directors of television commercials, assistant professors of marketing, disc jockeys, and the like. These people could afford expensive home renovation.
In 1975, the Chalet Steakhouse became the first restaurant on the beaches portion of Queen Street to be granted a liquor license. This marked the beginning of its gentrification. Local diners were replaced by expensive restaurants, and boutique shops took the place of secondhand stores that had been patronized by older residents. In 1980, a woman named Denise Meehan used a $5,000 loan to open a burger shop on Queen Street East called Lick's. Over the next 20 years, it would become a popular chain, and more importantly, it was my favorite burger place when I was a teenager. During the 1980s, a Queen Street restaurant called Lido's began offering a few hours of jazz music on Sunday afternoons. These performances became popular enough that the owner decided to organize a one-day jazz event in 1989. The following year, it became 2 days. In 1992, they added the Street Fest. By 1997, the festival had become so popular that Queen Street had to be closed. Today, the Beach's Jazz Festival is one of the major events of the summer, averaging more than 1 million attendees each year. And in classic Beaches fashion, the locals endlessly complain about the crowds descending on their neighborhood. In more recent news, a portion of the boardwalk and Woodbine Beach was washed away in 2017 when extremely wet conditions caused the water level in Lake Ontario to rise by a record-breaking 1.5 meters. In 2021, the beaches also became home to the newest musical venue in Toronto when History opened on Queen Street East. The venue was sponsored by Drake because, of course, it was. Finally, some of you will know that there's also a Toronto rock band called The Beaches because 3 of the members are from The Beaches. The 4th member is from Little Italy. She's the black sheep in the group. They had a #1 hit last year with Blame Brett and played Coachella just last month. Unfortunately, I have reached the age where I'd never heard of them before. But they seem pretty good, so you can check them out if you like.
Luckily, I have heard of them, and they are pretty good. It's great. They've got a really great social media. I love it. They're great.
Well, Gray's in denial about his middle-aged status. I've embraced it.
Wait, we've never even told how old. Wow. I guess middle-aged, 37 middle-aged, I guess. Close, approaching.
I have no comment.
Guys, thank you for listening to another episode of the My New York podcast. As always, I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser. If you want to find us online, our Twitter feed is Toronto_history. Our Blue Sky account is Muddy York, all one word. And our Facebook account is Muddy York History, again, all one word. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
I'd like to applaud Adam because out of the almost 2 years we have done this, that was the first time we were ready to go with our social media handles. Thank you very much. Big applause.
The memory goes with age.
All right, guys. Take care.